For the next 3 weeks on the North Idaho College Public Forum, we're very happy to present to you a documentary that was presented to us by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. The Kootenai County Task Force is a civil rights group that came into existence in 1980-81 and celebrated its 10th year in 1991. They've put this together in a documentary, as I've indicated, entitled Stand Up to Hate Groups by Saying Yes to Human Rights. They made this available, as I've indicated, and we're breaking it into 3 parts since it is a 90-minute production, and we'll bring it to you over the next 3 weeks. In part 1 that you will see today, we are going to talk about the years 1980 through 83, and that was the founding of the organization and its early years and the kind of work they did in supporting victims, and also during that period of time worked with prosecutors on the very first hate crimes that were taken to court in North Idaho in the year 1983. You will see that development as we talk about this whole process, and we will see the leaders that were involved with the task force in those first 4 years. And then when we finish that part of the program, we will show you the trials and what happened, and the result was a conviction. Please stay tuned for that documentary.
North Idaho, a land of quiet splendor, where the mountains rise and fall in forest green cascades, and the lakes and the sky echo one another's clear blue colors. Set in this natural arena of beauty, Coeur d'Alene has been called the jewel in Idaho's gem state. In 1970, an invasive element arose and threatened to rob her of the inner harmony that had always matched her outer beauty. Racism, with its senseless violence and tragic history, reached for a handhold in the foothills of North Idaho. This is the story of how one community responded to the threat within its midst. When threats erupted into violence, this community learned that you can stand up to hate groups by saying yes to human rights. The hate group that awoke the small town of Coeur d'Alene was made up of white extremists from organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Posse Comitatus, the Neo-Nazis, and the Identity Movement. Locally, the group was known by a variety of names: the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, the Aryan Nations, the Brotherhood, and the Order. Larry Broadbent, the former undersheriff of Kootenai County, has compiled an extensive chronology of the activities of these groups. He now describes the early acts of violence and racism that were attributed to these white supremacists.
In the spring of 1973, Richard Butler moved to Idaho from California. At that time, nobody realized that he had fled from the scrutiny of law enforcement, having served as an officer in the Christian Defense League, which is now known as the Christian Patriots Defense League. During the mid-1970s, Butler formed a local Posse Comitatus chapter in Kootenai County, Idaho, declaring himself the Marshal. After a series of minor brushes with the law enforcement and the courts, the posse quickly dissolved. As one ex-member commented, the reason he was leaving is he felt Butler was building his own private army. We should have heeded that warning. In 1979, Butler refound the Church of Jesus Christ Christian and made the Aryan Nations its political and activist arm. By 1981, the Aryan Nations held its first conference, which unified the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, both in the United States and Canada. It was because of that meeting we began to monitor the buildup of extremist members, and because of the violence connected with the Klan throughout its 100 years of history. It was this type of event that the victims that it produced that provided the catalyst to form the task force. Eventually, the task force activities broadened considerably. By 1983, these events had taken place. The militant stockpiling of weapons, recruitment of ex-felons, anti-government statements and actions, territorial imperative, that was the establishment of the white Aryan homeland in the Northwest, and the malicious harassment towards minorities.
It was in response to an incident of malicious harassment in 1980 that a small group of approximately 15 dedicated citizens visited the restaurant of a local Jewish man in Hayden Lake. His restaurant had been painted with swastikas and anti-Semitic graffiti. This citizen support for the restaurant owner included 5 local members of the Jewish community, 2 Protestant ministers, the Kootenai County prosecutor, and the Kootenai County undersheriff-elect, and the Kootenai County sheriff-elect, and a variety of local citizens. It was at this gathering that the idea was born for the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. From this initial visit, this small band of human rights activists learned that any task force on human relations can only be as strong as the community perceives its support for victims to be. Ann Salisbury Brown and Jenny DeLong recount their early efforts to support the victims of malicious harassment.
The Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations was originally a small band of citizens who came together to give moral support to those in the area who had been singled out as targets by bigots in the area. The original group gave personal and private support to victims. The most significant step in forging a strong image of victim support for the community was when members of the support group appeared in court with the victims when their tormentors went on trial.
A support group is the core of a new organization and must be quickly in place. Essential to its success is the availability of consultants in the legal field and in the handling of people in stressful situations. It is not necessary for the chair of this committee to have had training in these fields, but it is essential that the person can freely consult and call upon specialized resources. It is also helpful for the chair to attend some workshops at colleges or community centers regarding the effects of racism. Also helpful to have had experience to work with people of diverse backgrounds.
The objectives of the support group must be clearly set forth and faithfully implemented. We have 4 stated objectives. They are to be an ally of those who have been verbally or physically abused because of race, creed, or ethnic origin, to act as agents to prevent abuse in the community, to educate the community on the effects of bigotry, to provide a forum for those who desire to verbalize their concerns regarding racism and its effects on the individual and community.
To implement these goals, we have a loosely structured core group of about 5 people who brainstorm on the average of every 6 weeks to come up with ideas and programs meant to stimulate, educate, and actively involve other task force members. To involve other members, it has always been important to acquaint the community with our hands-on approach for victims. In the early days, we did this with the help of numerous concerned citizens. One, a reporter for a regional newspaper, through his coverage of the task force activities, made the public aware of the existence of the support group. The Social Services Department of the hospital, libraries, churches, the The college, supermarkets, and local businesses let us use their facilities to spread information about our group and our phone number. The head of public relations at the college arranged to have business cards for us at no charge. The Kootenai County Sheriff Department was also helpful in notifying the support chair of those in need of a call. Some victims preferred to talk only by phone, while others desired both a phone call and a follow-up visitation.
Not everyone contacted wanted to participate in all programs, and some contacts preferred not to participate at all. Some contacts were angry that we did not see the need and act sooner. The task force policy is to make an effort to let every victim know his or her legal recourse and what moral support is at hand. It is not always possible to know of incidents, as many are not reported and some are only rumor. However, we believe it is far better to act and be rejected than it is to miss making a contact.
We have learned a great deal about being a support group for victims of harassment. Our program has been one of trial and error, and in no way does the support group attempt to counsel. If counseling seems appropriate, the group directs the person to the proper resources. Our primary goal was and continues to be open and available for those who are hurting and labeled different, caught by the fear, insensitivity, or hatred of another human being.
The first 2 years of the task force were largely devoted to the creation of the Victim Support Group and to passage of anti-malicious harassment legislation. Also during this time, the task force struggled with an identity crisis of sorts. Not everyone involved in the task force wanted to be a visible means of support for victims. Others wanted to take a very active role, proposing legislation, staging rallies. Still others wanted to directly confront their opponents at every opportunity. The community itself was divided on its ideas of what to do. One school of thought promoted doing nothing on the theory that if you ignore them, they'll go away. Even local government was opposed to any active stand proposed by the task force. Finally, after many bitter debates, the task force reached a crucial decision. They would go public, and they would go public with a very life-affirming, positive stand. That decision is clearly reflected in the slogan of the task force. Saying yes to human rights is the best way to say no to prejudice. Dina Tanners, a member of the local Jewish community and an activist, put that slogan into action with her work on the anti-malicious legislation. She, along with Reverend Rick Morse of the First Christian Church and first president of the task force, is credited with creation of the task force itself. Here she describes their early legislative efforts.
When we first began, we realized a lot of people felt powerless because they did not know how to deal with the serious problems in the area. We decided to create an organization where people could work together proactively. In those first 2 years, 1981 and 1982, our efforts went toward victim support and toward the passage of a state anti-malicious harassment law. To obtain passage of the bill, I organized a petition drive in support of the bill. It turned out to be very successful. The drive produced a great amount of public and media attention and the support of political leaders and organizations. Kootenai County Prosecuting Attorney Glenn Walker assisted in drafting the legislation, and Kootenai County Undersheriff Larry Broadbent organized the support of law enforcement across the state. The campaign was greatly boosted by the creation of a statewide organization known as the Idaho Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. The state organization was put together by Boise political activist Gail Spicer, who presently serves as chair of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. The coalition, with the support of the task force, pulled together over 100 religious, business, civic, political, and human rights groups in support of the legislation. Ms. Speiser organized telephone calls, letter writing, resolutions, and lobbying groups with excellent media coverage. These events resulted in the passage of the bill on March 30th, 1983. A combination of well-organized campaign by the Idaho Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and the mistakes of the Aryan nations produced a victory for human rights. Following the enactment of the anti-malicious harassment law, there was a significant reduction in the number of incidents of harassment, graffiti, and hate materials.
Even before passage of the anti-malicious harassment bill, the Community Stand Against Hate groups made front-page news with the arrest of former Aryan Nations member Keith Gilbert on harassment charges. Those charges stemmed from acts and threats against Scott Wiley, then an 18-year-old member of a multiracial family residing in Coeur d'Alene. Recalling those days is Dana Wetzel, who was then Deputy City Attorney for the City of Coeur d'Alene.
On March 8, 1983, Scott Wiley made a report to the Coeur d'Alene Police Department alleging harassment by a person named Keith Gilbert, who was a member of the Social Nationalist Aryan People's Party of Post Falls, Idaho. 2 days later, Scott met with me, and he brought his mother, Connie Fort, to see if I would proceed and prosecute the case. At that time, Scott was 18 and very much afraid. His mother, Connie, was tearful but very determined. The two of them related the following incident.
Scott Wiley is walking home from school in February 1983 when a white van approaches him. The white van slows its regular speed of travel and continues to travel towards Scott at the same pace that Scott was walking. Scott looked over at the van and sees Keith Gilbert through the open passenger window of the van. Mr. Gilbert turns and says to Scott, "Your life is condemned, and you shall be served in front of the devil. You have betrayed your race to conceive niggers, and your time shall perish. Thou dost not come forth to my life." Scott becomes very afraid when he hears these words. The van speeds up, goes down a block, turns right, and disappears. Scott turns around and runs to an adjoining house, knocks on the door, is allowed into the house, and he calls his mother. A second incident takes place when Scott is returning home by bicycle from playing a softball game. Into view comes the same white van, again traveling towards Scott. Scott looks over at the van and again sees Keith Gilbert through an open passenger window. Gilbert leans out and says, "How are thee? Thou shalt not live long." Scott takes a shortcut through the parking lot and goes immediately home. As soon as he gets home, he tells his mother about the incident. Scott and his mother go to the Coeur d'Alene Police Department to make a report of the incident of malicious harassment.
This was not the first report that Scott's family had filed with the Coeur d'Alene Police Department and prosecutors. Up until a meeting with Scott and me, this was the first case that had ever been prosecuted. Prosecutions had not been pursued, largely because the problem had not been perceived as a large problem in our community, and because the incidences that were alleged were always incidences with just one person involved, where witnesses would be hard to find to verify the facts, or the victims were small children, so that testimony in court would be difficult to predict. However, in this case, on March 10, 1983, I determined to go ahead with prosecution. I decided to prosecute based largely on the demeanor of Scott Wiley. He would make a good witness. At 18, he appeared to be both sensitive but sensible. And it was obvious that he was very frightened from the incidences that had occurred. From the facts in the case, it was also very obvious that the act had been made to make him frightened and to me, that was against the law. The case took a considerable amount of research and time to prepare. During that time, the early members of the task force provided help and assistance in gathering facts surrounding the case. They also provided a lot of support and motivation to all of us involved in the case. And they were able to provide some information on Keith Gilbert that I otherwise would not have been able to find. And that information was useful, and some of it was used in trial. The trial was held on October 24th, 1983, in Courtroom 6 of the Kootenai County Courthouse. It was a jury trial. 6 members of the jury were chosen from a panel of ordinary citizens from Kootenai County. On the plaintiff's side, with Scott and I, sat Scott's mother, Connie Fort, and 2 women from the Kootenai County Task Force. They sat close together for support, and they listened intently to the testimony and to the arguments being presented. On Keith Gilbert's side of the courtroom sat 4 or 5 large men dressed in military wear, and they sat separate, watching closely the people in the courtroom as well as listening to the testimony. The testimony was presented by Larry Broadbent, Scott Wiley, Connie Fort, and 2 students from Gonzaga University who had been interviewing at the Aryan Nation compound and were able to relay statements that were made at the compound about the Scott Wiley case. Keith Gilbert had been charged with 2 counts of verbal assault, both misdemeanors. The first count was based on the first incident, and the second count was based on the second incident. After about 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came back in with a verdict. They found Keith Gilbert innocent on the first count, and they found him guilty on the second count. It took a great deal of courage for the Kootenai County jury to convict Keith Gilbert of harassment. They could have easily found him not guilty. There had been no other cases, to my knowledge, that had ever been tried in Idaho under the verbal assault statute. In fact, there were no other states in the Union except Florida that even had that statute. Because Scott was the only person that could testify as to the events, and there were no other witnesses to verify his statements, it would have been very easy for the jury to find Keith Gilbert not guilty. It was really the courage and the conviction of the ordinary citizens of Kootenai County that brought harassment to the forefront in that courtroom on October 24th, 1983. The judge later pronounced sentence on Keith Gilbert, and it was one of the harshest sentences ever given for a misdemeanor in this county. The judge sentenced Keith Gilbert to 75 days in jail and a $50 fine. Keith Gilbert reported to jail and served all 75 days without repentance. The Keith Gilbert trial was significant not only because it convicted Keith Gilbert of harassment, an act in which he had been engaged for over 2 years in Kootenai County, but that trial sent an important message to the Aryan nations that the law enforcement agencies and the prosecutorial arm of the courts were no longer going to quickly review and reject cases based on harassment. And even more important, the trial sent a message to the Aryan nations that the ordinary citizens of Kootenai County were not afraid to convict people for harassment. But the lesson to be learned from the Keith Gilbert trial is that the first line of defense, law enforcement agencies and prosecutors, are not always the best defense, the best agencies to provide defense to harassment cases. Prosecutors are often hesitant to take these types of cases to trial because the law makes it difficult to prove the case. Also, typically, these types of harassments take place when the victim is alone and there's no way to really independently verify facts. Because prosecutors are hesitant to take cases, it's often very important for people involved to pursue prosecution. Prosecutors are often hesitant to take a case until they feel that the people on the jury in their jurisdiction are ready to bring back a conviction based on the facts. Kootenai County is a good example. Harassment incidences had been occurring for over a year before the Keith Gilbert prosecution was actually taken to court. Had it not been for the determination of Connie Fort and her efforts to proceed and attempt to convince the law enforcement agencies and the prosecutors to take these cases, and had it not been for the support of the early Kootenai County Task Force members, the Keith Gilbert case most probably would have not gone to trial. The case is also a good example that you can prosecute harassment based on common laws that you have in your statutes, assault and battery. Later in Idaho, other statutes were enacted, but that was before the Keith Gilbert case. This case clearly shows that you can use the law that you already have in your state to be successful and convict people of harassment.
In March of 1986, a man named Larry Floyd Phillips arrived in Coeur d'Alene asking directions to the Aryan Nations compound. 5 months later, he accosted a black man in the local Kmart. He made racial slurs, pushed a shopping cart into him, and hit him with his fist. He was charged with the felony crime of malicious harassment, and he ultimately pled guilty. He was placed on probation and later moved out of state. It was the first time the new Malicious Harassment Act was used. It was a tough new law, and it made a difference.
Thank you for joining us in our program today, and I want you to be with us, if you will, please, next week and the following week, when we'll do parts 2 and 3 of the documentary entitled Stand Up to Hate Groups by Saying Yes to Human Rights, that's presented to us by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. Next week, we will deal with the middle years. Please be with us. Welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum. We're happy to present part 2 of this documentary from the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations entitled Stand Up to Hate Groups by Saying Yes to Human Rights. On today's part, we will see the years 1984 through 86, when the order from the neo-Nazi movement engaged in crimes throughout the Northwest and in fact the West, and how the Kootenai County Task Force responded to that and other programs that they were trying to promote for human rights throughout this very vital middle years of the task force work. I hope that you find this most informative.
The passage of the anti-malicious harassment legislation, the successful prosecution of Keith Gilbert, and the reduction in the number of incidents of harassment, graffiti, and distribution of hate material led members of the task force to assume that little effort would be needed to sustain these positive developments. Also about this time, the personal lives of some of the leaders of the task force took them to live in other cities. Thus, a period of inactivity took place from April 1983 to January 1985. The white extremists, however, were anything but inactive. From Seattle, Washington to Denver, Colorado, from Ukiah, California to Sandpoint, Idaho, the Bruder Schweigen I, or Silent Brotherhood, launched a national crime spree aimed at financing and fomenting revolution.
By the fall of 1983, the Brudersweigen, or Silent Brotherhood, better known as the Order, was formed by 9 members and launched a crime spree that involved robbery of an adult bookstore in Spokane, Washington, counterfeiting money, armored car robbery of $500,000 from an armored car in Seattle, Washington, bomb damages to a Jewish synagogue in Boise, Idaho, the murder of Walter West, an Order member, because he was perceived as a security risk, the murder of Alan Berg, a radio talk show host in Denver, Colorado, another armored car robbery netting $3.6 million in Ukiah, California, a shootout with FBI agents near Sandpoint, Idaho, after which Gary Yarborough flees. Found in Yarborough's home is a MAC-10 machine gun that was used to kill Alan Berg. A Missouri state trooper was killed by Order member David Tate. Another trooper was wounded in that gun battle. Aryan Nation Security Chief Bud Cutler was convicted of 4 counts of murder for hire. There's the bombing of adult theaters in Seattle, Washington, and there were arson. The Odyssey of the Order left a wake of criminal destruction in its path. Found as evidence or discovered and confiscated during the FBI investigation were over $4 million stolen from the robberies, an enemy hit list that included federal judges, federal prosecutors, FBI and federal agents, local law enforcement officers, and human rights leaders. Huge stockpiles of weaponry, ammunition, and explosives were recovered. Intelligence files of law enforcement officers were confiscated. Plans for more acts of violence, such as blowing up the Boundary Dam in Seattle, Washington, additional robberies of the Brinks main terminal in San Francisco, California, the disruption of shipping lanes in Puget Sound, Washington, by using laser-guided rockets and missiles, and the poisoning of municipal water supplies.
According to one task force member, the national outbreak of criminal acts by members of the Order, or Silent Brotherhood, again focused media attention on the white extremist compound at Hayden Lake, Idaho. North Idaho was being touted as not only the birthplace of the Order, but also as the home of both the Order and the Aryan Nations. This negative publicity moved local realtor and early task force member Marshall Mend to reactivate the task force in 1985.
I saw a serious problem. What this kind of publicity could do, not only to our area, but to our entire state, would be devastating. People from all over the country were picturing Coeur d'Alene and Hayden Lake as communities either under the siege of Nazi stormtroopers or a community that was supportive of white supremacy and racism, neither of which was ever close to the truth. I saw this publicity saying to the world, if you're a minority or if you're a person who believes in human rights, then Coeur d'Alene, Hayden Lake, and North Idaho is not a good place for you to go or to live. It was also saying that if you're a racist, a bigot, or a hate monger, then Coeur d'Alene, Hayden Lake, and North Idaho welcome you. That's what it was saying, but that was not true. I think North Idaho had a population of about 80 to 100,000 people. There were about 60 racists at most, and that's before many of them were sent to jail. They had no community support whatsoever. I knew something had to be done, so I went to see Sandy Emerson, who is the executive director of the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce. He was also involved in the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations before it became inactive. He also recognized the problem. What to do? We needed a leader, someone who couldn't be intimidated, someone with credibility and integrity, a person who could be the spokesman for the task force and our community. We both came up with the same person, Father Bill Wasmuth, a local Catholic priest at St. Pius X Catholic Church. Sandy and I went to see Father Bill. We explained the situation. I said, Bill, we're going to reactivate the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. We need a leader and a spokesman, and you have all the qualifications. He looked at me and said, what qualifications do I have? Well, you're not married. You have no kids, so you don't have to worry about them being harassed by the Aryans, and you live in a brick building. You'd be perfect for it. We laughed. He accepted. Of course, besides those qualifications, he was also an eloquent speaker, which made him perfect to be our spokesman, and he had the respect and was held in high regard by the entire community. Besides being a parish priest, he was also active in the community and was on the board of directors or involved with the YMCA, hospice, cult awareness, the Women's Center, and the list goes on and on. We had our first meeting. We outlined our problems and talked about our goals. I was made chairman of the Community Response Committee. Here are some of the problems and goals we identified. Number one, our community image was being destroyed by the media, linking the order and the Aryan nations to Coeur d'Alene, Hayden Lake, and the entire state of Idaho. Number two, we saw minorities being discouraged from moving to our area by these media stories. Number three, we saw these same articles encouraging racists, bigots, and other hate groups to move into our area. It was depicted as a haven for these people. Number four, we saw it affecting the quality of life of the citizens of our area. Number five, we saw both a social and an economic problem. Question, do we face the problem publicly and add to the publicity, or do we keep quiet and wait for the problem to go away? The task force came to a conclusion. Silence gives consent. We must address the problem publicly. Nazis never go away because a community is silent. Now, there were some of our community leaders who did not agree with our conclusion. They were wrong. We took a stand. We would stand up for human rights for all people, regardless of race, color, creed, or religion. We would let the world know that Coeur d'Alene, Hayden Lake, and North Idaho were for everyone. We believed that by taking this stand, we would improve the quality of life for all of our citizens, and it would have direct and indirect benefits for the community. One of the crucial decisions to emerge from going public like this was to join forces with North Idaho College. We went to see Tony Stewart, who was on the original task force. Tony is also the coordinator of North Idaho College Popcorn Forum and was the head of the political science department. We asked Tony if he would co-sponsor a program featuring a speaker on human rights. 2 days later, he called us and said he wasn't going to put on a program with a human rights speaker. He said we were going to have a week-long human rights symposium. He titled it, "The Problems of Racism." The caption under that was "Prejudice and Progress." There were 6 keynote speakers, including Julian Bond from Georgia, Ada Deer from Michigan, and Idaho Governor John Evans, who I think said it best when he said, "To be tolerant of prejudice and bigotry is to be a part of it." This was just the beginning of our association with North Idaho College. Since 1986, we've put on an annual Martin Luther King Day celebration. Usually it's the biggest in the state. And in conjunction with Tony Stewart, we have produced 35 half-hour TV human rights programs, which were broadcasted on public television. These programs are on videotape and are available at the North Idaho College Library.
Today we welcome you to the second of a 7-week series on a very, very important topic entitled Racism, Prejudices, and Progress. It is a very special privilege on behalf of the staff and myself to welcome the Honorable Julian Bond to our program, who is on our campus speaking today in this symposium.
What was it like to get your start as you did in the 60s, in the middle of the civil rights movement? You were young and black and Southern, and you came immediately onto the national scene. What are your memories?
Well, those are, as I think many of us recall, these were very exciting times, very emotional times. People in motion all over the country, not only in the South and the civil rights movement, but beginnings on the West Coast around Berkeley with the free speech movement, which eventually led into the Vietnam protest of the latter part of the decade. So it's just a tumultuous time. And I think among people who then were in their late teens or early 20s, there was a tremendous feeling of possibility of what could be done. That if you worked hard enough, if you organized enough people, if you raised enough questions about what you thought was wrong, then other people would see it and say, yes, we agree. And of course, sometimes that happened, sometimes it didn't. But more than anything else, I had a tremendous feeling of things that were possible, what could be done. And I'm not sure if today's young people have that same kind of feeling of their own possibilities of what they can do. But it was an exciting time.
Ada, you're viewed as a national Indian leader. You've been a motivating force to a lot of young people who have followed your struggle to gain the restoration of the Menominee tribe. You're considered a role model for young people. What would you describe what would you say are the qualities of an Indian leader?
I think each person needs to have an understanding of their own particular group, the history and the culture of their tribe, an understanding of the dominant society, and then the desire and the commitment to become involved and to deal with it. In order to do that, one needs lots of energy, dedication, intellectual honesty, and education, so that one can understand and cope and work with the dominant society, endurance, intellectual honesty, courage. These are not only necessary for Indians. These are characteristics that all good leaders need to have. And the ability to take risks, both personal and professional.
As more information came to light about the order, concern mounted among the people of Kootenai County. A public meeting was held, attended by 40 or 50 people, including Keith Gilbert. The presence of the white extremists at these meetings caused then-President Bill Wasmuth to ask all members of the task force to sign a statement of belief prior to speaking publicly at these meetings. The task force later decided that this was a violation of the First Amendment, and the requirement was discontinued.
This was one of the few times that we found ourselves in trouble with the media, who called this action a violation of the basic freedom, rights of freedom of press, etc. We took a different tact after that and drafted a statement of purpose and began using that statement in public meetings and with the media. Soon only those who agreed with our convictions participated in our meetings, and the problem was short-circuited, was taken care of. In short, this statement said that the people of Kootenai County were not racist, would not in any way support Richard Butler and the Aryan nations, and would oppose their hatred and their violence by positively pursuing the protection of the rights and freedoms of all citizens of this county, of this area. We also found it necessary to restructure the task force organization in order to channel the energy of the community more productively. The committee structure was enlarged to 6 committees, strengthened so that the work of the task force could be pursued through these various working groups. We ended up with these committees. Victim support. You've already heard about the beginning of this committee with Ann Salisbury Brown and Jenny DeLong. It continues to be a vital part of the task force and the work of the task force. The second committee was community response. This committee was formed to provide the community with a productive avenue of responding to the presence of the Aryan nations and to counter the bad image that the Aryan nations were giving to our community. Skip Cook was and is synonymous with the Committee of Community Response, and she's here to tell you a little bit more about the working of that committee.
It was in the second phase of the Aryan Nation harassment that we recommended the production of a poster. We wanted something that could be displayed throughout North Idaho, giving the silent message that the task force was here, that we cared, and how to contact us. Although we were all in agreement with the need for a poster, we struggled with the decision on who should design it. Some of us thought that a professional advertising agency from out of town should do it. Finally, in a decision backed by our need to face our own fears and to give ourselves the confidence that we as a community could confront the evil in our midst by ourselves, voted to do it ourselves. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It depicts the faces of North Idaho, the blacks, the Hispanics, the Asians, the Native Americans, the Jewish, and the white. The caption reads, "North Idaho is for everyone." With the creation of the logo, the task force finally had a visible and recognizable identity. The poster was first produced in 1985 and is still well received today. It is used on stationery, in real estate advertisements, on posters, on T-shirts and parade floats, billboards, brochures. It was meant to remind minority neighbors that the people here really supported their right to be here.
The entire task force and the Community Response Committee especially managed to turn the frustration and anger of the community into positive energy for the promoting of human rights. And it's this accomplishment that I am most proud. Who knows what might have happened if that energy had turned destructive or if that frustration had been allowed to churn in the hearts of the people of this county. What became the slogan of the task force was born out of this spirit. Saying yes to human rights is the best way to say no to prejudice. The third committee was the Education Committee. Recognizing that the education of children and youth is crucial for the long-range elimination of prejudice, the task force has always been seriously committed to working with the school systems to strengthen and to implement good social justice educational policies. Especially successful were the materials used throughout School District Number 271 in preparation for Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebrations. Tony Stewart from North Idaho College can tell you more about these educational efforts.
For 6 consecutive years, beginning in 1986, the task force and North Idaho College teamed up to co-sponsor the largest attended Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration in the state of Idaho. The King events held annually in January, including several parts. First of all is a children's program that is sponsored by those organizations along with the school districts in North Idaho, and each year over 1,200 students are in attendance. The formal program that follows includes a keynote speaker, the choirs of North Idaho College and neighboring high schools, along with essay contest winners, drama productions, film production, and a food festival. The Coeur d'Alene School District and North Idaho College, along with the city of Coeur d'Alene, closed their doors in 1986 to kick off the celebration with thousands of people in attendance. It is always a great way to start the new year in North Idaho.
The fourth committee was legislative. This committee successfully pursued major legislation, especially during the 1987 session. Among the legislation passed that year were the Domestic Terrorism Control Bill, which limited the paramilitary training practices of hate groups, the proclamation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a commemorative holiday in the state of Idaho, a civil remedies amendment to the malicious harassment legislation of 1983, which allowed victims to file for civil remedies if they were attacked, and the establishment of a Hispanic Commission for the state to represent the largest group of minority people in the state of Idaho. The fifth committee was legal. This committee was charged with assisting law enforcement with bringing criminal activity to light and criminals to justice. It was also responsible for answering the legal questions of the task force. And the sixth and final committee, Public Affairs Speakers Bureau. This committee is responsible for arranging public speaking engagements before various groups throughout the region. Good public relations and extensive use of the media and the sharing of information through the media have been and continue to be a serious goal of the task force. Most important, however, was the expanded approach of the task force at this reorganization time. We faced not just the radical expression of bigotry that was made most visible in the Aryan Nation's activity, but also the day-by-day prejudice of our community. For both of these activities were violations of the rights of some of our citizens. Through the task force, the community made its commitment to oppose bigotry and to work to eliminate prejudice, for injustice to one of our citizens was seen as injustice to us all. The independent spirit of the citizens of North Idaho is matched by their concern for respect for all persons and by their drive for freedom from oppression for all citizens. This expanded approach included a much more public phase of the task force, convinced that racism was never successfully opposed by silence. The members of the task force spoke out loudly and clearly with strong voices. The media was very helpful in providing one of the vehicles for getting our message through to the citizens of the area, to the members of the Aryan nations, and even to the people of the country at different times. Incorporated into this public voice was a very positive thrust. We stressed the richness of diversity. We stressed the positive changes brought about by the civil rights movement and the dignity and worth of every human being. All of the attention given to the Aryan nations and their violent activity provided the attention grabber, if you want, that we needed to get the attention of people so that we could speak to them the message of human rights. For us, it was not a matter of who was most powerful or of position one over another, one group over another, but it was a basic belief in what was right. Whether one's conviction stems from acceptance of the principles of the Constitution that all are created equal, or from a basic belief in human persons that understands that we must treat each other with justice and peace if we're to survive as a race on this dwindling-sized planet, or from a faith perspective that believes that God has created all persons equally in God's own image and likeness, the truth is still the same. It is right to treat others with respect, dignity, and justice, the task force believes. It is wrong to oppress others, to deny them their rights, or to act violently toward others. It is this basic conviction in what is right that provides the task force with its strength and energy.
By the end of 1985, the task force had indeed taken the initiative in the struggle against hate groups. No longer did the members merely react to the actions of the hate groups. They went out into the community and faced the problem head on. Current task force president Tony Stewart describes some manifestations of this change.
As mentioned earlier by Marshall Mend, the leadership of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, upon learning of the crime sprees in 1983 and 1984 of the Order and the arrest of the Order members in late 1984, as well as the death of Order leader Robert Matthews in a shootout with the FBI on December the 7th, 1984, made the decision in early 1985 to significantly alter its focus from an organization that had basically reacted to incidents of harassment to a task force that would now initiate many visible community activities. One of our activities was the educational programs that I've already discussed in this program. In 1986, the president of the task force, Father Bill Wasmuth, proposed an exciting and novel idea. He proposed that we bring together a 5-state celebration with the states of Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana to have a one-day human rights celebration in the city park of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The celebration did take place in 1986 and again in 1987 during the month of July. Each year, the day's events included a speech by the governor of the state of Idaho and proclamations and messages from other Northwest governors, telegrams from many organizations, along with letters from those same organizations, and local governments, municipal groups, ethnic foods, art, and readings. There was a special feature during the 1986 celebration. Coeur d'Alene attorney and later the president of the Kootenai County Task Force, Norm Gissel, coordinated a campaign to invite each county and city in those 5 states to join with us in the adoption of resolutions that would support the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and their own state constitution in declaring the equality of all persons. The many city and county resolutions that were adopted were on display at the 1986 celebration, as well as received with great publicity by the media throughout the Northwest. These resolutions sent a strong message throughout the Northwest that all hate groups would be opposed and equality and justice would be supported in the Northwest.
The Kootenai County Task Force was presented with a unique problem. The white separatists, of which the Aryan Nations was only one group, believed that they could establish a white separate homeland in the 5 northwestern states. We in the Kootenai County Task Force knew this, but we believe that others in the northwestern states did not know. In planning our human rights celebration, we wish to educate the people of the 5 northwestern states concerning the threat that the white separatists posed to us and what the white separatists had done in the past in furtherance of this goal, including the activities of the Order. We thought the most important people to reach with this message were the city councils and the county commissioners of the 5 northwestern states. We drafted a letter addressed to all the county commissioners and the city councils, about 1,000 letters in all, telling them of the white separatist designs on the Northwest and of the activities of the order. We ask in our letter that the county commissioners and the city councils pass a resolution in support of their own state constitutions and of the United States Constitution. Well over 200 cities and counties responded to our petition, and including all of the large population centers in the Northwest. What was interesting and of substantial value to our efforts was that in many communities, after the arrival of our letter, it was sent to a subcommittee, usually a Ways and Means Committee, and they would discuss this letter and make recommendations to the city council or to the county commissioners. This would cause a news article. Once the letter arrived at the city council level or the county commissioner level, discussions would ensue, and this would cause another round of newspaper articles. Then editorials would appear, as well as letters to the editor and general discussions in the community. The impact in the Northwest of these letters was very significant because of the news media coverage and the subject matter of the letters.
Please join us next week on the North Idaho College Public Forum when we will present Part 3 of the documentary, Stand Up to Hate Groups by Saying Yes to Human Rights. Until then, have a good week. Welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum and the third and final part of the documentary from the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations entitled Stand Up to Hate Groups by Saying Yes to Human Rights. On this segment, it will be 1986 through 1991, and it will deal with the bombings that took place in the Coeur d'Alene area and how the task force responded. I think you'll find this program most informative.
These positive efforts by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations did not go unnoticed or unanswered by the Aryan nations.
And again, in March of 1986, a pipe bomb exploded at the automotive repair shop in Hayden, Idaho. In July of 1986, Aryan Nation Congress held in Idaho. The main theme of the conference is the establishment of a 5-state white homeland in the Northwest. In August 1986, a pipe bomb explodes at another automotive repair shop near Hayden, Idaho. Also in August of 1986, counterfeit $20 notes were passed at county fairs in Idaho and Washington. Aryan Nations members were arrested and released on bond. In early September 1986, a pipe bomb explodes at the home of Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations leader, Father Bill Wasmuth. Late September, 3 more pipe bombs explode in Coeur d'Alene, the downtown area. A 4th bomb is found unexploded.
The small town of Coeur d'Alene reeled under the emotional impact of the bombings, but her people stood firm.
The bonding that occurred as a result of the bombing of Father Bill's house was strong. The feeling was akin to that of a close-knit but very independent family. We went our own separate ways until one of us was threatened from the outside, and then we would come together for strength and support. At no time was this more apparent than after the bombing. The community showered words of support and concern through phone calls and notes of encouragement to Father Bill. Shock and outrage emanated through the local communities like a shock wave from an earthquake, with Father Bill's house as the epicenter. State and local law enforcement agencies and the FBI immediately started a very intense investigation into the bombing. People in the community again felt touched by the Aryan movement. One of our own had been threatened. Bill was, of course, very shaken by the bombing, but unwavering in his determination to see the task force ideas through. His sense of humor again surfaced, which helped to ease the tension. Law enforcement officials were very concerned that good people would take law into their own hands in retaliation. There was talk of leveling the Aryan Nation's compound with tractors. These actions, besides being unlawful, could lead to more violence and possible bloodshed. Under Sheriff Larry Broadbent voiced his concerns on this issue at a special task force board meeting following the bombing. The idea for a gathering for solidarity was born to show community support for Father Bill, for our minority neighbors, and to ease the friction in the community in general.
The gathering took place on Thursday, September 25th, 1986, at North Idaho College. It was about 10 days after the bombing of Father Bill's house. It had a profound effect on many who attended.
The room was filled to overcapacity with a crowd of about 700 people from North Idaho and Eastern Washington. A format of quiet reassurance through songs, many from the Civil Rights era, non-denominational prayer, candle lighting ceremony, and an Indian prayer for strength from the four winds to our community, danced by a Native American board member, formed the evening. Idaho Governor John Evans asked to be on the program. His brief address provided assurance and a deep concern for us. Father Bill's remarks, although brief, were heartfelt. In attendance was Aryan Nations leader Richard Butler and a companion from the compound. They were allowed to stay as long as they minded their manners. Father Bill said that the evening was a very strong source of support for him. I feel I need to add that the task force could never, nor would never, have attempted the rallies, the meetings, and the gatherings that we did with the public if it had not been for the support and the encouragement from the law enforcement side of our community. Without that, it would have been far too dangerous to our community people to hold the group activities that we did.
The year 1986 ended on a very significant note for human rights. I, as mayor of Coeur d'Alene, was informed that the city would be the first United States recipient of the Raoul Wallenberg Civic Award. The award is given by the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of the United States, which is a nonprofit organization established to educate the public about Raoul Wallenberg, whose heroic efforts in Hungary during World War II saved the lives of over 100,000 Jews. The Swedish citizen was eventually arrested by Soviet troops and condemned to a Soviet gulag. Although his whereabouts today are unknown, he has been made an honorary citizen of the United States. The committee was created in order to generate national recognition for Raoul Wallenberg and to bring attention to his fate. Whenever possible, the committee also comes to the aid of persons or causes dedicated to the same principles and ideals personified by Raoul Wallenberg and to grant scholarships in his name. I was honored to accept, along with Father Bill Wasmuth and Larry Broadbent, the Raoul Wallenberg Award for all the courageous citizens of the city of Coeur d'Alene and Kootenai County during days of remembrance celebration in New York City. In my remarks at that ceremony, I told those present that we are not perfect and we are not free of the chains of prejudice, but that we are on our way. We have a plan of action that will, in the long run, show other communities what can be done when people unite in the name of simple justice for all. The award has been a light for us in our journey, and we hope a beacon for others. It helped us to see that the city government of Coeur d'Alene must continue to foster the basic freedoms and rights of individuals so that we may function without fear and trepidation in our daily lives. One of the actions taken by the Coeur d'Alene City Council was to vote unanimously to present the $5,000 Wallenberg Award to the city library to be used to establish a specialized section dedicated to those principles upon which Raoul Wallenberg lived during World War II. And very recently, in 1989, the city was also the recipient of the National Holocaust Committee's Award for our stand against racism. Another prestigious award. And this in itself, added to the Raoul Wallenberg, has given us all a light to follow in the future to establish those principles which we firmly believe here in the city of Coeur d'Alene, that justice and freedom must have grassroots as the established fact in the covering of those people who would do away with those freedoms in our own community.
Whereas both the Roll Wallenberg and the city of both Roll Wallenberg and the city of Coeur d'Alene have demonstrated that love for our fellow man, without regard for racial or religious differences, and the acknowledgement that we are all children of God, are stronger than the evil which is inherent in either hatred or prejudice. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Executive Board of the Roll Wallenberg Committee of the United States, on behalf of the committee's members throughout this nation, takes pride in presenting the Roll Wallenberg Civic Award to the city of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, on the 14th day of January, 1987.
By all accounts, Raoul Wallenberg was a man of imagination and courage. The motivation behind his extraordinary efforts on behalf of Hungarian Jews can best be stated in his own words. He said, "Where there is suffering without limits, there can be no limits to the methods one should use to alleviate it."
The award money enabled us to establish a wonderful collection, the Human Rights Collection, which is housed in the Nelson Memorial Room at the Coeur d'Alene Public Library. At the time of its dedication, the collection contained 229 volumes, 76 of them for children. The collection continues to grow and has almost doubled in size now just through the generosity of people that live in the community. The books, which covered every facet of human rights and the actions and beliefs that threaten it, were comprised of original classic works on prejudice, ethnic minorities, small groups, large groups. It covered all of the feelings and the actions that people sometimes don't understand, and so we collected personal diaries, biographies, bibliographies, photographic documentation, even fiction to tell the story that needed to be told. The selections were made so that individuals could have the opportunity to learn how dangerous it was to try to deprive human beings of the rights that should be guaranteed to all. There was another purpose, the purpose to awaken memories and hearts and conscience. We've included materials for children so that they could have a foundation to avoid the painful mistakes that the previous generation had made.
The shock and outrage at the attempted murder of the popular priest did much to solidify the human rights element throughout the entire state. It was now time for a major civil rights package to be introduced into the Idaho legislature. Dave Peters, a local public school teacher and then chair of the task force's legislative committee, and Tony Stewart, a political scientist at North Idaho College, recall those events.
The legislative committee was presented with the task of working with others to draft 3 major civil bills aimed at protection, prevention, and education. The first bill sought to provide a civil remedies amendment to the state's 1983 malicious harassment law that would aid victims of religious, racial, and ethnic harassment. The second bill, the Terrorist Act, sought to prohibit paramilitary training in Idaho, and the third bill would have established a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative day in the state. The Legislative Committee also agreed to support the Idaho Human Rights Commission's bill giving the commission subpoena power in civil rights cases. The rationale behind so much action at once was that it would be difficult to oppose such legislation in light of the terrorist acts of the order and the mood of the citizens following the bombings. Also, these violent acts were a clear illustration of the need for the legislation. The task force decided to move while the path was open.
The drafting of the legislation was very complicated and involved a number of experts from both political parties in the state of Idaho. Coeur d'Alene attorney Scott Reed, the husband of Senator Mary Lou Reed, conducted a 50-state research effort of civil remedies laws. Upon completing that research, he drafted the bill that was introduced by Senator Reed. We also had the Terrorist Control Act. It was decided early on in our efforts not to call it anti-paramilitary bill. It was developed with the excellent assistance of Idaho Governor John Evans' staff, along with Idaho Attorney General Jim Jones' staff, Kootenai County Prosecutor Glenn Walker, Coeur d'Alene Civil Rights Attorney Ray Givens, Dave Peters, the chair of the Task Force Legislative Committee, and myself. We then had the King Commemorative Day bill introduced. It was drafted by a legislative staff under the direction of Senator Mary Lou Reed. The Idaho Human Rights Commission was responsible for the drafting of the subpoena bill for that session in 1987. And as you can see, all of these were bipartisan and well-informed groups that were helping with this package in the legislature in 1987. The next step involved the strategy for passage of these bills. The most crucial decision was the selection of the lobbyists that would represent the task force in Boise, Idaho. We agreed that our president, Catholic priest, Father Bill Wasmuth, would join with Louise Shattuck, a very prominent and well-respected Republican leader in the state of Idaho for many years. They joined forces to attend and testify for all the legislation that we have identified in this report. It was a powerful and successful combination. It should be added that we had excellent and constant media coverage on a daily basis of our efforts during the 1987 session. Louise Shattuck also worked with the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Don Loveland. This was very critical to our efforts because it was a vital step in receiving the needed support in the House, which was much more difficult than the state Senate in the passage of the legislation.
The legislators from Kootenai County and members of the task force got together, strategized on just exactly what to do to make sure that a package of bills could be put through the legislature that would carry the message that Idaho was not going to become a haven for bigots. They tried to decide whether or not to put this bill through the House, another bill through the Senate. The decision was made to introduce first Martin Luther King Commemorative Day bill in the Senate. That went through, went over to the House. We also, in the Senate, introduced a bill that would deal with civil remedies against malicious harassment. So as a result of daily, almost daily conferences with members of the task force, the legislative session was very successful. I think that the seriousness of the bombings in Coeur d'Alene really had created the climate for the legislators from other parts of the state to be receptive, and they were receptive. They were very responsive. Most of those bills went through the Senate with a unanimous vote in favor. In further additional years, we were able to get through a bill that dealt with hate crimes reporting, and then very successful, and it was a great day for Idaho in 1990 when the legislature passed a bill which was not a commemorative day, it was a Martin Luther King Day holiday. In the general things that went the best were the strategizing between the task force and the legislators, and just the recognition that it was very important for the rest of the state to understand the seriousness of the situation. As a result, we really feel that we have one of the best packages of civil rights legislation in the whole country, and we hope to continue with that kind of a record.
The result of legislative efforts in 1983 and 1987 is that Idaho has the toughest anti-hate crime legislation in the country. The anti-malicious harassment law makes it a felony to harass anyone because of race, color, religion, or ethnic background. The civil penalties law allows a victim of harassment to sue for actual punitive damages and attorney's fees. The Terrorist Control Act makes it a felony to engage in paramilitary training in Idaho with a hefty prison term and fines. Task Force member Larry Broadbent asked me to build on these legislative successes. The Uniform Bias Crime Reporting Bill was introduced in the House but failed in the Senate. It became law after reintroduction in 1989 by Senator Reed. The law requires law enforcement to report crimes based on race, color, or national origin. The task force legislative goals were reached when Governor Andrus, in his 1990 State of the State message, called for the establishment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Day. Senator Reid sponsored the bill. It became law in April 1990.
A signing ceremony for Senate Bill 1348 was held in Boise, but celebrations were held statewide. From Boise, Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus talked to a Coeur d'Alene gathering via the telephone.
Coeur d'Alene, North Idaho, is a significant reason for the passage of this legislation. A lot of people, Tony Stewart, whom you mentioned, Bill Wasmuth, and others who, yourself and others, who fought off the bigotry that some people tried to paint upon the face of North Idaho. You've done an outstanding job, and I appreciate it.
The success in the legislature showed that the people of Idaho would not retreat in fear before the threat that lived within her boundaries. The task force had secured for itself a reputation for courage, action, and persistence. This time, there was no thought to resting on their laurels. The task force knew that if their victories were to stand, they must remain ever active, ever vigilant. In 1990, the city of Coeur d'Alene was presented another prestigious award. The National League of Cities voted Coeur d'Alene one of the 10 winners in the 41st Annual All-America City Award competition sponsored by the Allstate Foundation. The award is given in recognition of community efforts to solve current problems. A key factor in the selection of Coeur d'Alene as an All-America city was the community's stand in advocating human rights. This was the stand led by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations.
The most significant impact of the new focus by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations has been a growing public awareness of the wrongs of prejudice and the destructive nature of hatred and bigotry. We knew that one of our tasks would be to continue this public awareness. An example was the All-American City Award for Coeur d'Alene in 1990, which brought attention to our cause and a public awareness of the human rights movement in our city. Another way in which we reached beyond the limits of our community was in assisting other communities throughout the Northwest in the creation of similar task forces in their communities when they faced such threats of hatred. One such example was the founding of the Sanders County Task Force for Human Dignity in the neighboring state of Montana. A delegation from our task force went to that county and were treated like royalty. We came away with very good feelings of the people of Montana and Sanders County and knew that their future would be bright. One of the things that has been especially exciting for me, and that occurred as a spinoff of the 1986 Human Rights Celebration in the city park of Coeur d'Alene, was the idea of developing a regional human rights organization. It was my privilege in the year 1986 to contact Kootenai County Task Force President Bill Wasmuth, who had had the idea of the celebration of the park, and to suggest to him and also the chair of the Task Force Community Response Committee, Mr. Marshall Mend, the idea of a 5-state human rights group. After much work, Bob Hughes, who is with the United States Justice Department in Seattle, joined with us in putting together a 17-member steering committee for the purpose of looking at this plan. Those steering committee members came from the states of Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And after much dedication and success in writing bylaws, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment was established on April the 3rd, 1987, and the signing took place on the campus of North Idaho College. This civil rights corporation is providing a number of very valuable services throughout the region of the Northwest, including an annual conference in which people come from throughout the Northwest and around the country to talk about ways of eradicating prejudice and bigotry. There is also a monitoring committee within the organization that does quarterly and annual reports about incidents of malicious harassment and violence throughout the Northwest. There is a community response section of the organization to help communities deal with bigotry. There is educational services working with primary, secondary, and higher education institutions, as well as with the general public. There is also a victim support section that works with individuals and organizations that have faced bigotry in the Northwest. Another exciting activity of the Kootenai County Task Force took place in April 1989. At the time that the Aryan Nations were having their first racist skinhead conference at their compound outside of Hayden Lake, the Kootenai County Task Force put together a whole week entitled the Human Rights Week here in the county of Kootenai. During that week, we started with a celebration of the 20th birthday of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. The governor was present, as well as the executive director of that commission, and also the state senator who had brought about the bill 20 years ago. We invited children from the public schools, and we had hundreds of children teaching them how to celebrate the birthday of the Human Rights Commission. One of our visual aids was a 20-long-foot cake that the children enjoyed at the end of the ceremony. Also that week, we distributed 6,000 orange ribbons throughout the county. They were on buildings, on cars, and people were wearing them to send a message to those who are visiting our county and dealing in hate, that we would reject that hate and that we would work for human rights. The ribbons sent that message. We also had a picnic for human rights in an adjoining small town called Rathdrum, Idaho, on that Saturday at the end of the week. And then we closed the week on Sunday with an interfaith service with the Jewish community and the Christian community from the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene areas, joining in hundreds of individuals celebrating the rights and dignity of all persons, of all religions and non-religions, and of all races and colors. When the first 10 years of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations is reviewed by Northwest historians, it is my belief that the task force's most lasting contribution will probably be listed as our educational efforts throughout those 10 years to the general public, as well as to the public school systems and colleges and universities of our area. These educational efforts have been extensive and have included many activities, including plans for the elimination of prejudice and bigotry through teaching of a curriculum in our schools of the wrongs of bigotry. A second effort has been the Dr. Martin Luther King celebration that I discussed earlier with you, when we have thousands of people during those 2 or 3 days to come together to understand human rights through the teachings of that great leader, Dr. King. We have also sponsored PBS programs, now over 30, that have been broadcast throughout the Northwest, talking about the principles of justice, equality, and freedom. In addition to that, we've held a number of workshops and symposiums and seminars. One was a week-long symposium on the problems of racism, with leaders from many ethnic and minority communities around the country joining us in that symposium. In addition to that, we've had numerous appearances as task force members before Northwest organizations and institutions, speaking to them about our principles and our work for equality. We have also used public service announcements on radio and local media from such effective organizations as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith that they have shared with us. We have also developed a number of materials that are used by people in our region. In addition to that, we have held press conferences and press releases for the purpose of speaking out and looking at all of society as a classroom in which we can talk about what we believe to be the right way for all people in this world to work and live together. And at the end of the first decade of the task force, as we're taping this program, we have had our first youth camp on human rights, composed of children from the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene areas. Therefore, I would conclude that in the end, the work of the task force will be recorded as the proper path to take in the dignity of human relationships.
The work begun by 15 not-so-ordinary citizens of an ordinary rural county in northern Idaho continues today. Some of the faces have changed, but the commitment remains the same. Success hasn't been measured by the constancy of individual task force membership, but rather by the overwhelming number of people who consistently stand together in times of trouble. The members of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations have learned much during the last 10 years. Much of what they have learned has been organizational and mundane. They meet more frequently than ever before. There is more structure to the organization and to the work that it does. They know they must never relax their efforts again. Other lessons are more profound, harder to grasp. They have learned that when a handful of people stand up to an evil within their midst, that the American spirit still lives. The handful becomes 100. They have learned that the roots of bigotry and prejudice are deep, and that there is still much to be done before there is a generation of children to whom hate groups are just a part of history.